At 6 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of metal screaming in my backyard. By the time I got outside, barefoot and half-dressed, Marjorie Pike was standing beside my driveway with a clipboard under one arm, while two hired workers smashed apart the rainwater tanks I had spent nearly $4,000 building. 900 gallons of clean water rushed across the concrete and vanished into the storm drain, and Marjorie watched it go with the satisfied smile of someone who thought she had finally put me in my place. My name is Eli Warren, and until that morning, I was just the quiet electrician on Cottonwood Lane. The guy who fixed porch lights for widows, kept his grass short, and avoided neighborhood politics. I had moved to Cedar Hollow 2 years earlier after my marriage ended, and all I wanted was a small house, a decent workshop, and enough room to grow tomatoes without anybody offering advice. The rainwater system started as a weekend project, something my grandfather would have respected because he grew up believing wasted water was a sin. I installed sealed food tray tanks, filters, a first flush line, an ultraviolet purifier, and enough buried pipe to make everything work without bothering anyone. It was clean, legal, and quieter than Marjorie's mouth, which was saying something. What she did not know was that most of the water never stayed on my property. Behind the old recreation hall sat a community garden run by Helen Carver, a retired nurse with bad knees and more backbone than the entire HOA board. 24 older residents depended on that garden for fresh vegetables, people stretching Social Security checks, paying for prescriptions, and pretending they were doing fine when they were not. I buried a line from my tanks to their irrigation system, and for more than a year, rain from my roof had kept their beans, peppers, squash, and tomatoes alive through summer. I never put my name on a sign or asked for credit, because helping people loses something when you need applause for it. Marjorie discovered the tanks through a gap in my fence. 3 days later, I received a violation notice claiming they disrupted the visual harmony of Cedar Hollow, which was impressive language for 2 green tanks nobody could see from the street. She gave me 48 hours to remove them and threatened a daily fine. So I went to the next HOA meeting with permits, photographs, and enough paperwork to make a normal person reconsider their life choices. Marjorie sat behind a folding table like she was governor of beige houses, flanked by 2 board members who looked trained not to blink without permission. I explained that the system was safe and protected by state law. She barely glanced at my documents. Then she leaned back and said, "Some people move into a good community and immediately start testing how much they can get away with." I asked what exactly I was getting away with. Saving water? Following the law? Helping neighbors? Her smile disappeared. "This is not about water, Mr. Warren," she said. "It is about residents understanding their place." The room went quiet, and right then I understood that Marjorie did not care about tanks, safety, or property values. She cared about obedience. What I did not understand yet was why she needed those tanks gone so badly, or why, as I left the meeting, I saw her whispering to a local developer while he pointed directly toward the community garden. I did not confront her that night, mostly because anger makes people sloppy, and I had spent 20 years working around live electricity learning that sloppy gets expensive. Instead, I drove home, made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and started documenting everything. Every ignored boat in a driveway, every oversized shed, every satellite dish Marjorie somehow never noticed. I photographed them all, because if she wanted to talk about visual harmony, I was going to make sure harmony had a paper trail. The pattern became obvious fast. People who supported her were allowed to break rules. People who questioned her received certified letters. It was not enforcement, it was loyalty management. Meanwhile, without my tank speeding the garden, the damage started showing within days. Ellen called me on Thursday afternoon and asked if I could come by. When I arrived, I found Mr. Capley Alvarez carrying 2 plastic jugs from his truck, moving slowly because of a bad hip, while Dorothy Mills, 79 years old and barely 5 feet tall, dragged a garden hose that did not even reach the far rows. The soil had started cracking around the tomato plants, leaves curled inward like burned paper. Helen stood there with her hands on her hips, trying to look angry instead of scared. "We can keep this up for maybe a week," she said. "But some of these folks cannot lift water, Eli. They come here because this garden keeps them healthy." I looked toward Marjorie's house across the greenbelt and saw her sprinklers running in perfect silver arcs over a lawn nobody walked on. That image stayed with me. The next morning, a county inspector appeared at my door after someone reported an unsafe and unpermitted water system. He spent 20 minutes checking tanks that no longer existed, then another hour reviewing photographs, permits, and the remaining plumbing. Finally, he shook his head and said, "Whoever filed this complaint either does not understand water systems or understands them perfectly and wants to waste your time." I handed him Marjorie's violation notice. He sighed like a man who had seen her name before. By Monday, she had filed 2 more complaints, one claiming I violated drought restrictions by collecting rain, another claiming my wiring created a fire hazard. Both were dismissed. The inspector warned her that false reports could become harassment, but Marjorie responded by calling an emergency HOA meeting. She came prepared with a slideshow about mosquitoes, contaminated water, and falling property values, complete with stock photographs that looked like they had been stolen from a medical documentary. I almost admired the production value. Almost. Then she announced that the board had authorized permanent removal of any replacement system I installed. That was when Helen stood up from the back row. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Those tanks water the community garden," she said. 24 seniors depend on it. Marjorie blinked once, then recovered. The HOA is not responsible for private charity projects. Charity project, Helen repeated, like she was testing the ugliness of the phrase. Dorothy ended up in urgent care yesterday after carrying water in 90-degree heat. You were hurting people over 2 tanks you cannot even see from the road. One board member looked genuinely sick. Marjorie did not. She just closed her folder and said the rules had to be applied consistently. I laughed before I could stop myself. Consistently, I asked. Should we start with your vice president's boat or the 3 illegal additions on Hawthorne Court? Her face tightened, and for the first time, I saw fear underneath the arrogance. After the meeting, a woman named Rebecca Sloan approached me in the parking lot. She had served on the City Planning Commission years earlier and knew how land deals worked. She asked one question. Did you know Marjorie's real estate office has first rights to represent the HOA if common land is ever sold? I felt the night change around me. Rebecca explained that the garden sat on nearly 3 acres of land zoned for residential expansion, land worth far more as townhomes than vegetables. If the garden failed, Marjorie could call it unused property, push the board to sell, and collect a commission large enough to solve some very serious financial problems. Public records filled in the rest. Her husband's business had tax liens. Their house had been refinanced twice. They were drowning, and the garden was the rope she planned to grab. Suddenly, every complaint made sense. She had not discovered my taint by accident. She had found the one thing keeping the garden alive. The next day, Marjorie invited me to her office and offered me $2,500 to remove the system voluntarily, along with immunity from future violations. The agreement included a confidentiality clause. I read it twice, then asked, "What happens to the garden?" She gave me a blank smile. "The garden is not your responsibility." I leaned forward. "No, Marjorie, but apparently it is your opportunity." For the first time since this began, she had nothing to say. I left the unsigned agreement on her desk, called Rebecca, called Helen, and called my friend Marcus, the best plumber I knew. By sunrise, we had a plan to rebuild the system, bigger, safer, and completely monitored. Motion sensors, cameras, automatic data backups, water quality logs, everything. If Marjorie touched it again, she would not be fighting my word against hers. She would be fighting timestamps, video, inspectors, 24 angry seniors, and a land deal she had been stupid enough to think nobody would notice. 3 days later, the new system was running. 1,200 gallons of storage, sealed lines, solar-powered pumps, and cameras aimed only at my property because I wanted evidence, not a lawsuit about privacy. Marcus stood beside me while the first water moved through the buried pipe toward the garden, and when the sprinklers came alive, Helen covered her mouth with both hands. Dorothy sat on an overturned bucket and cried as the dry soil darkened around her tomatoes. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. We just listened to water hitting leaves, a simple sound that somehow felt like a victory. Then Rebecca arrived with copies of the original Cedar Hollow Charter, and buried inside it was the sentence Marjorie had hoped nobody would ever read. Water conservation projects were not only allowed, they were specifically protected. That meant every fine, every threat, and every order she had issued against me violated the HOA's own governing documents. We planned to present everything at the election meeting on Saturday, but Marjorie did not wait that long. At 2:38 Friday morning, my phone lit up with a motion alert. I opened the camera feed and saw her in my backyard wearing dark clothes, carrying a crowbar, moving toward the control box like someone who had rehearsed the route. I called the police, stayed inside, and watched her raise the crowbar over equipment that was uploading every second to 3 separate servers. The officers arrived before she made it past the second camera. One of them asked what she was doing on my property at 2 in the morning. Marjorie pointed at the tanks and said she was protecting the community from an illegal hazard. The officer looked at the permits taped inside my kitchen window. Then at the crowbar in her hand. "Ma'am," he said, "community service usually does not involve breaking into somebody's yard." By sunrise, half the neighborhood had watched her leave in handcuffs. Saturday's HOA meeting was packed. 71 residents showed up compared with the usual 11 people Marjorie could control. Rebecca presented the charter, the dismissed complaints, the land contract, and Marjorie's financial connection to the proposed townhome project. Marcus played an audio recording from a diner meeting where Marjorie had offered him $5,000 to declare my system unsafe. Then Hallen stood and described every senior who had lost food, every crop that died, and every hospital visit caused by people hauling water in summer heat. Marjorie tried to interrupt, but nobody listened anymore. When the votes were counted, she lost her seat by 49 votes, and every board member who had protected her was removed with her. As she headed for the door, Dorothy called her name. Marjorie turned, and Dorothy held up one red tomato from the first plant that had recovered. "You called this garden worthless," she said. "It was worth more to us than your commission was worth to you." 6 months later, Cedar Hollow had a new board. The garden had doubled in size, and 9 families had installed rainwater systems based on mine. Marjorie's real estate license was suspended during the investigation, and she eventually pleaded guilty to criminal property damage. Some neighbors said losing her career, her position, and most of her savings was punishment enough. Others believed she should face charges for the medical harm caused by destroying the garden's water supply. I still think about that question whenever rain hits my roof and the tanks begin to fill. Was Marjorie a desperate woman who crossed a line while trying to save her family? Or was she a corrupt bully who knowingly put vulnerable people at risk for money? Tell me what you think in the comments. Did the community deliver justice, or did we go too far? And if you have ever watched an HOA abuse its power, share your story, because silence is exactly what people like Marjorie count on.